In the 20th century, Ukrainian science fiction was political from the very beginning. For example, there was Volodymyr Vinnychenko, who wrote a novel, The Sun Machine. It's a story about inventing a perpetuum mobile, the engine that works with no need of fuel. This is a pretty advanced technology that makes communism possible. And so the question becomes, what kind of socialism or communism should a society build once it has all the technology in place? Volodymyr Vinnychenko is a technocrat. He believes that technology can change the society for better. It was in line with Marxism and maybe even Marxism-Leninism. So Vinnychenko was actually just among the historical losers for Soviet historiography, but they considered him to be a good political writer. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that Volodymyr Vinnychenko created a template for Soviet science fiction that is interconnected with politics. Vinnychenko was a lawyer by education. He graduated from Kyiv University in 1901. Together with Grushevsky, he was one of the biggest names in first Ukrainian independent government of 1917-1919. Besides writing The Sun Machine, he also authored the Ukrainian Constitution, technically the fourth directive of independent central government of Ukraine. Vinnychenko lost his political struggle with the Bolsheviks, and he emigrated to France, as many other political figures like Nestor Makhno, an anarchist, and others. So there was another period of time when Ukrainian writers became politicians again, and it was at the other side of the Soviet project in 1990. That was the moment when the power officially split from one communist party into multi-party system. Ukrainian writers were mostly united by the official union of writers in the USSR, but actually they were the core of the dissent during Perestroika, and before, even in the 70s, was the group of Helsinki. And at the end of the Soviet Union, writing became again a thing that they shared ideologically. Writing itself is direct access to readers, and it means that they can create ideology. And in a sense, if we believe that every intriguing author is also an intellectual, then we can see Plato's utopia in this image, right? That they're a philosopher at the top. A philosopher, but not a poet. That's the thing. Thinking should be really rationalistic while being innovative. That's the challenge for most science fiction writers. It's a common idea in the field of political science that Plato's Republic is a utopia. So a first science fiction novel, let's say. There was a short period of time when Ukrainian science fiction was not political. It was in the 30s until the death of Stalin, obviously. After that, the people who were arrested became science fiction writers again. It's, for instance, Arkhip Teslenko, Oles Berdnik. That was really common among Ukrainian writers to actually have the experience of the gulag, of a prison somewhere in Siberia. In the 60s, when ideological authority stopped being a big crime, science fiction writers from Ukraine could pick two possible paths. Either to become a really well-versed Soviet citizen with Soviet fantasies about the future and science, like Anatoly Dniprov and Vladimir Savchenko, or they went through repressions and they had really bad experience with the Soviet government. However, in the moment when there was a possibility to speak up, both groups of these writers actually chose one ideology. The distinction between those who adapted to the Soviet system and those who resisted it suddenly disappeared in late 80s, early 90s. Vladimir Savchenko and Oles Berdnik co-authored a piece that basically described the time as the time at the boiling point. So I think these two different embodiments of possible identities of a Russian-speaking Ukrainian who actually sells out for Russia, and on the other side, a Ukrainian-speaking nationalist who serves years in labor camps, they saw a really different future, but something united them, and it was metaphysics. What is metaphysics? Metaphysics is a spiritual, a religious teaching about how the world is. So from science fiction writers, they shifted towards being preachers, theologists, while also denying Marxism-Leninism. That's why they were pluralist in a way. And I will focus on Volodymyr/Vladimir Savchenko and his role in this essay and how he concluded it with his further writings. I think that Savchenko is not an easy case. And it's not only about his identity and belonging to one of cultures, either Russian or Ukrainian or maybe Soviet. No, it's about something else. It's about actually him being really ambivalent about things he praises. Just to remind you, the main character in Soviet science fiction is the progressor, and I studied this character in Yefremov, Strugatsky brothers, and Shakhnazarov. You can listen about this in my other episode. The progressor is a powerful figure with superior knowledge from the future who can do something that a regular folk cannot. But the thing is, Savchenko's progressor always ends in a fiasco or in a really ambivalent situation where it's hard to tell whether they're okay, whether they're crazy, or maybe they're genius. A typical progressor from other writers' work has their solutions to inferior people problems. The progressor is the subject of an ideology that erases any problems, especially a technical one, or an ideological about diversity and pluralism of opinions. I also mentioned the concept of the new human in other episodes. The new human is the goal of this ideology because all the people are not perfect for the ideology. Most people are actually rotten, they're not fitting well, so they have to change. Maybe new people have to be created, but the whole concept is only new people can be real, full subjects of the ideology, and if so, then this ideology is monist. And Marxism-Leninism is one of such ideologies, as well as nationalism or national Bolshevism or any kind of blindness to difference. This blindness usually means that people have to change. They have to fit something that is not seen by the ideology. In Savchenko's writing, most of the time we see the progressors who are 50-50 borderline characters. We don't know whether they succeed in their experiments or just crazy. The ending is open. And this dramatization of intellectual surge that can end in fiasco or an ambivalent act of self-sacrifice or suicide for science, it puts science also in the position of not being defined yet. We as readers also cannot help this problem. We cannot solve it. We don't know whether the scientist is right. That's how Savchenko initially started arguing that science is irrational, and that's why it has to become metaphysical in order to actually show what it is. And Yefremov also spoke about science being metaphysical, but it was in a really different, superficial way. Here in Savchenko, metaphysics means just self-reference as metaphysical. Science is not real. It's another metaphysics. It's just a little bit different religion. And science fiction is a way to create a pseudo-metaphysics, I guess, to show that science is not real. Science is just a language. In relation to this, I think it's important to see the difference between Savchenko's real biography and the biography that he constructed himself in the interviews in 1990s. He was born in Poltava in 1933. He died in Kyiv in 2005. He was 71 back then. His two main texts are The Self-Discovery of 1967, and it was translated in the 70s in English, and The Rank in the Universe, which he finished in 1990. He used references to Ukrainian things like Cossacks, landscape, but also Mykola Gogol. I think for him, Gogol was the example of someone becoming imperialistic, someone overcoming his own ethnicity and background and becoming a Russian writer, as Savchenko himself said in his interview of 1999. And Savchenko speaks for the Russians in his novels. But if you really look into what he mentions when he says about Russians, it's usually nasty stuff. So I understand why he wouldn't say that he is not Russian. Then it would really change the attitude towards him as a person. If he admitted that he's Ukrainian, he would have been asked for all of his critical remarks. But if he is Russian, a Soviet Russian, then he had some authority to speak for that identity. In The Rank of the Universe, 1990, he basically claims that Stalinism is Russian. So I guess it helps to understand his article with Oles Berdnik in 1990, The World at the Boiling Point. Savchenko later, in 1990-1992, Savchenko explored the option of writing non-science fiction in newspapers. In 1989, he used his non-science fiction, his metaphysical theory even, basically argue that Chernobyl exploded not because of a mistake or some kind of technological problems, but because a physicist didn't know something about physics, that uranium expands faster with every year. So in 50 years, it started expanding even more. And that was the reason for the explosion at Ukrainian nuclear power plant, Chernobyl. Of course, this is complete bullshit. And I think it forms the impression of Savchenko as the person. I think that actually fighting real understanding of what happened at Chernobyl with a metaphysical, science fictional idea is very political, and it shows the level of science and political science in the Soviet Union at the end of the 80s. The article about Chernobyl was published in newspaper Ukraine in 1989. At the same time, we see that speculative discourse that includes some scientific knowledge became a substitute for ideology. Savchenko's, as well as Oles Bernik's discourses functioned as the substitute for something that they cannot say in the discourses that existed. And for Savchenko, it was Marxism-Leninism. If he probably said something about class consciousness or solidarity among people after Chernobyl, he would not be plausible, he would not be interesting. But if he used science fiction and this kind of really weird and improbable idea of uranium expanding, he created a parallel discourse that supported Marxism-Leninism, but in a really, really metaphysical way. Actually, many science fiction writers came to represent their own metaphysics, and Savchenko in his later writings actually uses references to Indian philosophy and so forth. Exactly as early writers from the 50s and 60s, there was nothing extraordinary about this, but in political sense, references to religion was not to promote religion. None of science fiction writers who I discussed, the Strugatsky brothers, Yefremov, Lem, and Savchenko, were not religious, that's for sure. They were not metaphysical for real too. But the invention of their ideology was the reference to metaphysical concepts to show that the language itself tricks people to believe in metaphysics. It just can be the metaphysics in a scientific discourse, or in a religious discourse, or in artistic discourse, and it's better to know that all these discourses are just constructed. They are not representing the reality. That's the great project of science fiction, to put all the concepts in such context in which they no longer are connected to the feeling of existential, ontological, something that is real and cannot be changed. Also, I speculate that the reference to all these old cultures and philosophies, religions, manifest that culture is forever. Culture does not depend on technology, on the level of knowledge, sciences, and so forth, that we can have the same knowledge throughout centuries. So if culture is kind of immanent, it exists in all centuries, the only way to convert new believers is new metaphysics. That's why authors like Savchenko or Bernik choose science fiction to preach for scientific ideas in politics. I think that comparing to the Strugatsky brothers and Shakhnazarov, Savchenko is not a really progressive writer. Metaphysics opposes the dogmatism of Marxism-Leninism, but with another monism. Even if this monism is expressively fake, constructed, and not metaphysical, it all ends up by needing a hierarchy of values, ethics, and so polarization of society happens anyway. And Shakhnazarov, as a pluralist, proposed something better. Just a quick blurb for those who didn't hear about this. He also thought that culture is immanent, but he used it to show that it always converges for worse, and there should be certain theoretical steps taken to get out of this. And these theoretical steps cannot be metaphysical. Metaphysical would be irrational. In Savchenko, we see that rational is metaphysical. Anything that you know transcends your reality and makes you superhuman. Shakhnazarov would not believe this. So I think that actually Savchenko puts Ukrainian as a part of greater Soviet project. That's the part of his identity. And Shakhnazarov deconstructed this idea of linkages. There is no connection between any cultures. There is no connection between individuals. These connections can exist only in emotions for Shakhnazarov. Savchenko has undermined his Ukrainian identity since he published a lot in the 60s only in Ukrainian and it was not translated into Russian. In his late interviews in the 90s, he seemingly forgot about this experience and he argued that he's a Russian author. And maybe this actually helped him to get published still in pretty good shape, 35,000 copies several times across Russia. It's really important to look in what happened in Savchenko's science fiction before he entered the political scene at the end of the 80s. His metaphysical theories appeared in the writings of the 60s, after 68, and they were always announced by genius/crazy scientists. It's only in non-fiction that Savchenko made these ideas of his crazy characters into kind of speculative science. I guess that what he said in Ukrainian newspapers had impact on the perception of what happened in Chernobyl or in other relations. So if you suspect that there may be some misinterpretation on my side, and maybe his essays on Chernobyl and the world at the boiling point meant something else than trying to reiterate Marxism-Leninism for new young audiences, maybe, okay, maybe he was an innovative ideologist. His science fiction, non-science fiction theory had the same name, the theory of great flux. And the idea was that we perceive the reality as pluralist, but if we become superhuman with our super consciousness and super knowledge, then we would feel that everything is connected. It's like a flux, and he uses the image of the water. This super being is nothing else than Marxist-Leninist quest for new humans. But these new humans should feel instead of know. I believe that there should be no expectation of Savchenko being anything else but a good Soviet Marxist-Leninist Russian imperialist writer. He is a science fiction copyright of already existing politics and ideologies. The notion of pluralism that appears in his novel, mostly novel, The Rank in the Universe, is about the limitations of our perception, that we actually perceive everything as pluralistic because we don't feel how it's connected. And the feeling is subjective, so if one feels that everything is connected and he sees other people not feeling everything being connected, then he probably may suspect that they have worse epistemology, worse seeing than him. Savchenko describes the future of this project, the Soviet project, whatever, as really traditional, and he says it himself in his interviews in the 80s and in the 90s, that his world is highly educated, technical intelligentsia among men. So there's a huge question of how to treat a writer who declares that he is an orthodox, that he is sexist, but at the same time he does it in such a way that it undermines itself, and even the way he transferred his scientific discourses from science fiction to non-science fiction says that he is almost like this borderline character, the narrator, who doesn't really prove that he's not crazy, but at the same time, without doubting, it's impossible to progress. So that's the part of how one should feel. Can this be applied to Savchenko's political identity? Someone of being Ukrainian, because he wrote in Ukrainian, he published his first science fiction in Ukrainian newspapers, and no way it would be published anywhere else. In Ukraine, during Perestroika, he had some local authority to speak about political matters. Maybe the essays that were whitewashing the tragedy of Chernobyl cost him his reputation, and that's why he could no longer feel a Ukrainian author. Chernobyl's explosion was a symbolic end to any possibility to reform the Soviet Union just ideologically. This explosion showed that Marxism-Leninism is wrong in one premise, that ideology is the product of the material base. Actually, what happened in Chernobyl probably could have been evaded if ideology was different. Basically, Chernobyl strategy showed that over-planning and pursuit of maximizing profits did not end well. It was a fiasco. Soviet civilization created a technologically dangerous place where such explosions will happen. We're still not over this. So we live in the world of demodernization created by Soviet power and Soviet ideology. As I argued in my other episodes, particularly on Shakhnazarov, the subject of ideology during perestroika is this new human, but coming out of crisis with no possibility to trace the reasons, why this subject appeared. I think that Savchenko is one of a few non-pluralist authors who showed the crisis of the subject in detail. Instead of course, thinking rationally and deciding how to change one's identity, this subject flipped into metaphysics, but we see that there was this need for epistemological shift to adapt. So Savchenko's subject is a converted subject. As I said, Savchenko was really open about writing for men, and his project is the part of the patriarchy. This already creates supernatural boundaries between men and women as somebody different ontologically in their bodies, in their thinking, consciousness. Savchenko himself was an engineer, a writer, right? He was very masculine and he had his vision of how to be a man in this traditional society. There are certain marginal female characters who have engineering jobs, but the whole idea is that he just saw the Soviet project as the patriarchy. These supernatural boundaries created in the patriarchy cannot be overcome, and Savchenko shows why. Because of men, they continue to reproduce them through technology. We can see this in the behavior of the borderline characters with their egoistic and destructive and suicidal behavior. So this is my blurb, an introduction to Volodymyr/Vladimir Savchenko and his complex identity. I really recommend to read his self-discovery, which can be found in American libraries, or his novel, A Rank in the Universe, which unfortunately was not translated in English, but it's available in Ukrainian, Russian, and Polish. And if you got interested in the relationship between science fiction and politics, subscribe to this channel and wait for other episodes.